there we are, Kalinda. I'm so happy to be back here with you for a little bit more of a discussion about data sovereignty and your work in Australia after your wonderful talk just now at the WiDS Apex session. And for those of you just joining us, I'm joined here by Kalinda Griffiths from Darwin, Australia. And she is a Scientia lecturer at the Centre for Big Data Research in Health at the University of New South Wales. And I'd like to start, Kalinda, by simply asking you, what are some of the messages you didn't have time enough for to discuss in your talk that you really want the audience to hear about?
I think we covered off most of the things that I wanted to highlight, primarily around recognition, building capabilities, and then measurement. But we didn't go into the discussion around measurement and what we can actually do with the data once we have quality data on Indigenous peoples or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people specifically. And so, you know, the measurement side of things often is missing from the discussion point. And what I mean by measurement is, you know, what measures do we actually pick to have the descriptor? And we didn't go into the discussion around deficit models. And so, you know, there is a legacy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Indigenous peoples around the globe, whereby anything to do with measurement has been fraught with negative storytelling. And so, you know, this brings with it, a push for ongoing legacies, pushes ongoing stereotypes and that continuation of negative stereotyping that we actually don't want to see. So how do we actually better understand this? And you know, some of the work that we've done, particularly in cancer research, has been around different approaches and different underpinning theoretical models that can be used to drive nuanced understanding of distribution of cancer, as an example. And so, you know, just as a full example, cancer in Australia is 2 times, lung cancer in Australia is twice as incident as for Aboriginal people than it is for non-Indigenous people. And so that's the general story that's told. But the moment that we start to have a look at that by different measurement approaches, so things like having a look by socioeconomic status or remoteness, we can start to see where this distribution lies. And so those people who are living in cities, as an example, have the same outcomes, so the same mortality rate as non-Indigenous people versus Aboriginal people who live regionally and remotely, who are 8 times more likely to die. So the measurement approach really makes a huge difference in regards to, 1, what we're describing, but 2, where we can kind of direct resources as well. So it really kind of illuminates some of those issues that exist in societies.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the questions that came up from the audience during your talk was what you were most hopeful for, excited about in your research. And what do you think, what sort of data-driven research could have the biggest impact on your people in Australia? And so you mentioned this cancer research. What else would you really like to see done with data-driven research for the Aboriginal population in Australia?
Yeah, I think one of the exciting things in my work is that I'm often at the cutting edge of linkage approaches. And so in Australia, we have quite well-established data linkage processes in play. And, you know, back in the 70s, I think, was when the first data linkage program of work happened in Western Australia. And now data linkage in Australia is quite robust across certain data assets or data sets. Within health, it's pretty straightforward. What really excites me is the fact that we've got all of this education data, justice data, all of this publicly collected information, so administrative collections, that can be accessed as well, which can tell us part of the story, not all of it, but it can tell us part of the story. And so I've been lucky enough to be a part of a few linkage programs, including within the Australian government, where we're able to link those data assets. So Australia has MADIP, which is a data asset within the Australian Bureau of Statistics, that has all of those data sets that are publicly collected, so those administrative data collections, and being involved in kind of having a look at life course developments as well. So we're able to actually track people over a lifetime. And so being able to do that and being engaged in that, and being able to do it so much so that we're able to then actually, again, it's about where to put resources, but it's also so that we can get a picture as to where some of the issues are. I think that data linkage is really very exciting, and data linkage with population level data sets is something else. So that, and as we move to kind of using sort of the bigger data as well, and that metadata, that's going to be an exciting space to move into next as well.
So one of the other listeners realized, as you were talking, that it was quite a lot of work to get the support from the Australian government in the work that you're doing, and to really create a culture, or help create a culture where this is supported from the government. And she is working with native Indian data here in the United States, and she was wondering, or Native American data, sorry, and she was wondering, what sort of advice you have for people who are listening and really want to also go into this area of data sovereignty and data management for Indigenous populations, and how to get that government support that is so vital for success.
Yeah, look, there has been quite a lot of advocacy done within Indigenous data sovereignty over the past 5 years, and I mentioned in the talk that it has grown very quickly during that time. With that said, in Canada, as an example, they recognise governance processes around information and data were really very critically important. While the terminology has only been around for 5-6 years, the actual history behind the development of that has been embedded within advocacy and governance development. So in Canada, there's the First Nations Information and Governance Centre, I think it's called. And so those guys drove much of the discussion across Canada to kind of push it forward. And in their decision making as well, what they ended up doing was they kind of held Stats Canada to account on a few things. And so it was about opening up the door to have those discussions, and finding people who were able to kind of open the door for people from the stories that I've been told. Here in Australia, going off the back of FNIC and other data sovereignty groups, including the Chimana Waranga Māori Data Sovereignty Network, as well as the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. These guys have all kind of bolstered and refined some of the discussion around this, which has made our job here in Australia much easier. So in Australia, we have a couple of different groups. So one is the Indigenous Data Network, and the other one is the Mayim Ngāti Wangara Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Data Sovereignty Collective. Both of us work together, but we have separate remits. And a lot of the work that we do within the National Indigenous Data Network is work with government. And so, it has been founded not just on the relationships that came from our own history as well, but for those people who had been influenced by those previous discussions at the international stage, going back to the 2010 development of FNIC and other things as well. So it's not necessarily like a put your hand up and open up the door. It's a whole heap of things that kind of play into creating a space where, we're now part of the discussions as to what happens across each of the departments with their data and information. Part of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Statistics Working Group with the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, as well as a couple of other national groups as well. So it's about being aware of, what's occurred in the past, I think, and kind of showing what works and what has, I guess, promoted direction. And while I come from a space of idealism, like these are quite serious issues, and so, it's about recognising that perhaps maybe it's not always having people at the table isn't always about ensuring that their rights are met. It can also be about learning about what's happening as well. So it's just recognising where your allies sit as well.
Have you noticed have you noticed in Australia, as your work is progressing, that industries are also more open to talking to you about inclusion and maybe potential bias in the algorithms that they're developing and using in Australia or outside of Australia?
Yeah, I get invited to speak to a lot of different groups, including like the Commonwealth Bank here in Australia. And so everything from, technological sort of stuff. And like I am part of Science Technology Australia's Superstar of STEM group, and part of that has kind of opened up a couple of doors in terms of being able to, speak to the science sector a little bit more about these issues as well. And ultimately, people are really very interested in how to do it the right way. Often if you aren't exposed to Indigenous peoples and, if there is no recognition or understanding about what's actually occurred within the space, which may have caused those tensions particularly, then there isn't really a reason to kind of step forward into, a data sovereignty method, I guess. Whereas if you are aware, I haven't met anyone who has kind of walked away from a talk and gone, oh no, we don't want to do this the right way. Everyone that I've come across has said, this is actually the right way to step forward. If we're going to actually do this in a way that, prioritises Indigenous knowledges, understandings and values, and aspirations, then we actually need to kind of, work with Indigenous peoples. And that journey is quite a long one for people, particularly if you haven't worked within an unequal power dynamic in the past. And I mean, when we speak about this unequal power dynamic as well, we're not speaking about very small inequalities. We're speaking about expansive and huge damage. And so in Australia, as an example, like we had massacres, and this is not a sad story to say, kind of, as a bad storyline, but we had massacres, we had children taken away from their families, like my grandmother was a stolen generation, so she was actually taken from her mother and put into care as a child. And so that was done at the government's hand, and so you can kind of imagine what it's then like working within, government and industry that supported all of those actions, for the trust to be rebuilt. And so there are real tensions there that come from very conflicted and quite catastrophic events throughout history. And so once people are aware of all those things that have occurred and why those tensions exist, there hasn't been anyone who said, actually, no, we're just going to do this on our own. So I think, moving forward, there's going to be a lot of interest in data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance, and how you can actually enact this in a really efficient, good way. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the other questions that came up was a question about any cultural barriers that there may be in the field of data science, also when it comes to um, uh, applying or using algorithms that are out there, or research that's out there. As an example, my colleague who sent in this question said, that he's worked on DNA analysis for personalized medicine for quite some time. And they would really like to get DNA analyses also done in some of the indigenous populations here in the US and Canada. But there is a real cultural barrier to that for some of the tribes. Um, are there examples like that also in your work? And if so, how have you overcome those barriers?
A lot of this has to do with that storytelling that I just told a minute ago, around the lack of trust. And so it's not necessarily cultural barriers in Australia. I don't know exactly what it is in the US or Canada or elsewhere. But in Australia, it has been due to not trusting researchers with their data and information. And so, you know, one of the things that comes out of this then is a push around health literacy. I just did a presentation for SING, which is the genomics group, and some of the push at the moment, particularly around heart disease and diabetes, is to kind of drive a genomics precision medicine approach. And so some of my colleagues have been working quite, I guess, hard on this. And that trust is still being built. It's going to take a long time to kind of see where people fit, because this falls not just into the realm of, having someone take blood and, do assessment. This has to do with identity and where people kind of fit. And so our history was around blood quantums and blood quotas. And I know that in the US, blood quotas are used for identification, but in Australia, it's a really big no-no. And so that's kind of pushed back around actually the progress in kind of stepping forward with genomics. And because of the stolen generation as well, the identity of where people fit is a very different story. So Aboriginal people were taken from one place and taken to another place. And so there's very different kind of clan group mashups that wouldn't have ordinarily existed in the past as well. So, yeah, I don't really have the answers to the genomics question yet, because it's going to take a very long time, and this has to do with health literacy. So I think the start of this has to do with genomics literacy, recognising how that information is being used, and, to note as well that, data often has been used around that negative stereotyping, and has been used without permission about Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples generally. And so, as we kind of move into this sort of data sharing sphere where genomics data is shared, that needs to be, I guess, a topic of discussion to figure out what people want. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Kalinda. We had many more questions to ask you, and we could have probably stayed on for another hour or two, but I appreciate you coming back for a little bit more of a deeper dive, and good luck to you and all your research, and thanks again.